I'm Ryan. This is my first talk at BostonEmber. I'm not gonna lie, I'm getting nervous having an EmberData core team member sitting right in front of me.
I don't know anything about EmberData, don't worry.
But I'm going to talk about a problem that I was having, and I think a lot of people that are new to Ember have, and that's around nested routes on your front end versus nested collections and nested resources on your back end. So Ember is very opinionated. The Ember CLI sets you up to use nested routes on your front end. But if you've tried to hook this up to a nested backend before, it doesn't work as one might expect. So just to clarify what I mean by nested route and what I mean by nested resources and collections, if you look at the top, you'll see a typical route. This is what you'd enter in your address bar. You enter parents. That would then be resolved by your router, and eventually you would render a template. Likewise, if I entered parents/10/children, I would resolve this in my route. That 10 would be interpreted as a path parameter, and I would render the page through a template, which all looks great. Now on the back end, you might want to mirror this directory structure with collections and resources. So parents is an example of a collection. There are many individual parent entities or resources. If I want to access one of those resources, I do parent/10, which will get me to a particular parent. If I want to access all the children belonging to a parent, which is a sub-collection, I add children. And if I want to access an individual child belonging to one parent, that's a sub-resource. So the TLDR here is, if you can use the happy path, do so. The happy path is to use flat collections on the back end. And you can pretty much ignore everything I'm about to say if you flatten your API endpoints. The problem is, to flatten your API, you must control it, and we don't always have that luxury. I did a quick survey of sort of common APIs people might want to consume. Facebook, GitHub, AngelList, all of them have nested collections and nested. And the other thing, which is a little bit more subtle, is there's actually a different semantic meaning between something being a top-level collection and something being a sub-collection. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. So this wouldn't be complete without examples. For my examples, I'm going to use bacon and aioli. I did this in part to make fun of the Ember pluralization rules, because I get to talk about lots of bacons and aiolis. And if you want to follow along, everything's on GitHub, and the branches are named sensibly. So master for things breaking, nested, blah, blah, blah. Right, so we can use Ember CLI, and we can generate our nested routes. When you do that, it'll look like this. It's really quite straightforward. We're following pluralization rules, and we're using a path parameter for our bacon ID, and the application will look like it looks on the stage right. Where you have your different levels and you render. So I wanted to mock up a backend for this. Now you can either return POJOs directly from your router. You can use fixtures. You can use a mock where you can actually use a real backend. I decided to use HTTP mock, which is a lovely feature I didn't even know about. It's available from the Ember CLI, and you can mock an Express server for you to use, and all the Express goodness you're used to is right there. I did this. I created an API collection for API/bacons, like pluralization, and a API endpoint for bacons/bacon ID, which is the path parameter. And it works, yay! I updated my front end so that I'm rendering the model IDs in level 1, and I'm rendering attributes about bacon in level 2. So for example, ID 1 is crispy, and I rated it 9 out of 10. And you can see the back end works just fine. I do the same thing for my sub-collections and sub-resources, which are my aiolis. And things break. So in my naivety, being somewhat new to Ember, I kind of expected some magic to happen for me to resolve the API endpoint where aiolis is a sub-collection of the bacon resource, but it looks for a top-level collection. Which is what you're saying where that 4.4 error is. My backend is working just fine now. So I know it's an EmberData consuming issue. So naively I say, oh, Ember is clever. Maybe there's some magic. Maybe I can dynamically maybe I can use a dynamic namespace. So to get it to work with API, I add namespace. Maybe if I add bacons and pack parameter namespace, that'll work, but it actually doesn't. Maybe if I were to nest my aioli model under bacon, maybe that would work. It seems to work for routes. Maybe it works for models. It doesn't. So before we take a deep dive into how to make it work, I'm going to go over the happy path once more. When I refer to flattening a resource, you go from aiolis as a sub-collection of a bacon resource to aiolis as a top-level collection. And you can use a query parameter, bacon ID, to show you that. So on the left, you would have what you would do sort of normally for a normal high-level collection, where you just do a find all on aioli, it pluralizes and gets your data, to what's on the right. Now, the problem here is I need to get the bacon ID so that I can use it for the query parameter. I chose to use model 4 for this. There might be a better way. So you can use the sort of belongs to attributes, for example. But model 4 works. It gives me a bacon model. I can then take the ID off of that model, pass it as a query parameter, and construct the query so that this will work. Unfortunately, there's buts around flattening things. I think one of the subtlest buts, but probably the most important, is that the resource representations of a sub-collection are different than the resource representations for a collection. So put simply, bacon 10 aiolis 1 is not the same as aiolis 1. So a sub-collection is nested and dependent on the resource. So if I had, say, bacon's 10 aiolis and bacon's 11 aiolis, those are actually completely different. Those are different sub-collections. They don't talk to each other. The IDs are different. They're distinct. They're wholly encapsulated within the resource. If I'm talking about aiolis bacon with the query parameter, I am saying I have a collection of aiolis, and I'm going to query for whichever ones are associated with bacon 10, whichever ones are associated with bacon 11. Subtle, but it can be important. The other but is if you wanted to try and do clever things like put query params directly on resources, I was not able to find a way of doing that out of the box. You have to modify find record, query record, or you can hack it and construct some sort of monstrosity of a REST endpoint with adding additional query parameters. So that's flat. That's the happy path. Let's talk about version 1 of the not happy path, which is buildURL. So when you use this.store, any of the methods, find all, find record, etc., you're going to be going through a built-in method called buildURL. So what I'm doing here is I am passing a parameter, bacon ID, which I'm getting by model 4, through this thing called adapter options so that it can be picked up in the adapter. Then in the adapter, I'm saying, give me whatever buildURL we're giving me so I don't have to overload the individual methods because there are 11 of them and I didn't really want to do that. I then replace API because I told it my namespace was API with API/bacons and the path parameter that I'm passing through adapter options. It's really hacky, it's really nasty, but it works. And so the reason you have to do this is you only have access to certain things in the adapter. You have model name, ID, snapshot, request type, and query. For find all, you don't have any queries. The only one that you can actually put data into that is always being passed is the snapshot. And if you're curious about snapshots, you can look up the documentation behind them, but there's not much there. It just says it's a private method called snapshot. You have to. I went through and kind of inspected what was in snapshot to see that I could pass through adapter options and other things that were associated with the snapshot. It works. You can see that I am, before tampering, I had API aiolis. After tampering, I have my nested resource. Unfortunately, the path, this URL.replace is really nasty. It's implicitly coding, hard coding, what my resource representation is like, which is really, really bad to do. I'm hacking buildURL, which might lead to some problems down the road, but it does mean I don't have to overwrite the individual URL formats. So that first problem I mentioned with implicitly sort of hard coding the path is solved by this add-on by a guy named Ariel. I don't know him, but I love his add-on. It's called data-URL-templates. You can actually import data-URL templates, define a URL template, which has the definition of what your URL looks like. So I'm constructing it. It's host, namespace, bacon ID, aiolis, and ID. ID is resolved automatically. Bacon ID, you see it in red here, is resolved from URL segments. And then you can write in whatever you want to be resolved in URL segments. You can pass through query. You can't use query with find all or find record. So I'm passing through snapshot in the same way I did before. And that works. And this is a much more elegant, it's a much cleaner way of constructing your URLs for dealing with nested resources. Because in this URL template, you can define anything you want. And you write it once, you define your URL segments, and you're good to go. But there's an issue with the scope of URL segments. And I mean, one of the people on my team actually contacted the author to see, like, is what you wrote here on Stack Overflow actually like the current state of play? This URL segment gets type and ID, which you can't really use to pass anything. Snapshot and query. Query is not used out of the box by find all and find record, so you're kind of left with snapshot. The author actually recommended using query for everything, but I thought that was a bad idea because the front-end developers have to know that you're using a non-standard version of query and they can't use the other this.store methods. The author also recommended that you could use a service if you wanted to store things that wasn't a snapshot. The problem with that is that you're now encapsulating application static, which should be handled by the router in a service, which is bad. So yeah, many thanks to this guy for writing this add-on. It's kind of an open question community. There's been a PR on this outstanding for 2 years, and I don't really know why. The other thing I found really interesting is that the initial proposal was to actually do something similar to the namespacing, but instead of calling it namespace, they called it URL. But what I've written up here, that doesn't actually work. You have to explicitly name the URL segment and explicitly use the URL segment, passing data through it by either snapshot or query, or doing it behind the scenes by a service. This talk will be complete unless I mention links. If you sort of talk to people and they say if you want a quick and dirty way of hooking up to a HATOS API that actually gives you the links, you can use this. I tried using links with the REST adapter and JSON API adapter. I couldn't get it working. I looked at the documentation. There isn't much. But long story short, the way it works in principle is that in your model, you say, bacon has many aioli. You do an asynchronous load. And then in your bacon resource, you have the link. And what this should do is that when I say bacon.aiolis or bacon.attribute aiolis, it'll resolve it, call the link, and then side load the data in. Unfortunately, even if this were to work, to the best of my understanding, you can really only use this for read-only data. You can't use any sort of query parameters, any of the niceties that you're used to. So if you can use links and get it working, then it might work for you, but it's definitely not a silver bullet. So what we did is we used the happy path. We took our API and we flattened it. This is kind of unfortunate because for the particular problem that we were dealing with, having a sub-collection become a collection actually makes no physical sense at all. We were dealing with electrode arrays, and you cannot have an electrode independent of an electrode array. So being able to query over electrodes at the highest level and having to have sort of globally accessible electrode IDs doesn't really make that much sense for us. And it also means that we have sort of more authorization control in our backend than we would have needed otherwise, because we need to make sure that users can only see electrodes that belong to them instead of being able to allow them the resource. It was the happy path. It was the most expedient thing to do. If you're new to Ember, there are a couple of gotchas on nested routes, which I didn't talk about. Go to this post. Gotcha number 1 and 2 are using the Ember CLI. If you use the Ember CLI, you'll be fine. These are my contact details. If anybody knows better solutions for this, if anybody knows why PR has just been sitting for 2 years, I would be glad to talk to you. It's a standing problem for us. We punted on it by flattening everything, but it would be nice to have a nice, way of connecting to Nest APIs without going through basically all this bullshit of having to construct URLs and blah, blah, blah. That's all. Questions?
I don't know the stats. I don't know what changed with that. I mean, go that direction.
It's hard.
It's hard.
Yeah, well, one point that I wanted to make, don't do the service thing.
Yeah, so to clarify.
It's basically a race condition waiting to happen.
I know, so to clarify, a lot of people were saying, all right, this URL templates thing is great, how do we actually use it? And it comes down to having to pass things to your URL segment.
Yeah.
The author said, flatten everything, for the love of God, flatten everything if you can. If you can't flatten everything, use query parameters and push things through query, not snapshot. But I think only 2 of the 11 URL builder methods actually use query, which means that you're handicapping your front-end developers with what they can access through EmberData. So I decided to pass through snapshot. And then for our services, in his defense, the example that he used for services was if you wanted to populate a user's name. So say, Robert had some comments. He actually suggested get Robert's username from a service, which we would already have available, the user service, and then postpen with comments. His intention, as far as I can tell, was not to pass global router state through a service. That is a horrible idea.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a horrible idea. But you can do it.
We just put it all on Windows too.
The global service.
It's fun.
So I've used links in the past and these ones pretty well. I'm curious what the problems you had with wiring that up. Was it specifically around JSON API or?
No. So what it comes down to is I was loading the models. So in my in this application, at each level, I'm loading the model directly. But the aioli model, I can't load it directly. I have to load it through Bacon. So if I were to modify this a little bit, and for my level 3 and level 4, I would have say Bacon attribute has many or belongs to aiolis. I should be able to access aiolis through Bacon and have it sideload. But because I attempted to resolve the model directly in the router, it breaks. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
So you mentioned that there's semantic benefits of being able to nest switches on the back end. Can you just summarize a bit why you decided to flatten that?
Because it was expedient.
Okay.
But-
you also said that if you didn't flatten, then you wouldn't need to access.
Mhm.
Maybe that's I'm just curious.
No, it is. So I decided to flatten because anybody that picks up the front-end application in the future doesn't need to talk to me if they're using EmberData out of the box. If I do this weirdness, so forget about passing through query because I think I don't agree with that. But doing this weirdness, passing through adapter options, every new developer that comes through is going to say, A, what the hell is a snapshot? B, how is it getting from your router to your adapter? And it opens a Pandora's box. And for what we're doing, it was easier to just put in the access control on the back end than it was to teach every new Ember person that comes through that wants to play with something on the front end that every time you use that store, you have to pass some additional information through adapter options. I am not aware of a cleaner way of doing this. If you have a cleaner way of doing it, do tell.
Yeah, no, I was just going to mention that after options, we had similar problems with similar requirements for our constraints with our API, with like nested resources and links were pretty well. So without any structural. And the second one is, yeah, no, in a second, it's like service is always kind of looks good in the beginning. But yeah, we ended up using adapter options a lot and customizing.
I mean, if you're gonna do this, I think this is the fine way to do it. Also, as an aside, this snapshot method is private, but snapshots are not private, right? The thing you get from it is public, right? So if there's missing docs there, we should probably maybe think about it and open an issue, and we can try to flesh that out some more.
Thank you, guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan.